We've been hearing from people who've basically admitted to us that they don't really know what the Labour plan is.
And I think it does represent a real challenge to Keir Starmer, because what if there are other important reforms, but maybe unpopular, that he wants to do in future? How on earth does he secure a majority?
They don't really have a shape or a feel for what's in Starmer's mind. You understand what they say they're going to do, but you don't really believe there is a narrative, a story or a shape to what is driving the Prime Minister in terms of getting policy through.
I was speaking to one of your Labour colleagues in Parliament one morning this week, and they said there were some new MPs who haven't spoken to Keir Starmer since he became Prime Minister. Have you had any contact with him?
No.
Not at all in 12 months?
No.
Do you know of other colleagues in a similar position?
Oh yeah, I think there's a handful of us. I mean, I think I've been in I've been in the chamber when he's been in answering questions and so on and so forth, but I've never actually had a conversation with him.
That is the Labour backbencher, Neil Duncan Jordan, saying 1 year into this Parliament, he still hasn't met, hasn't spoken to the Prime Minister. And is that in a way the crux of Keir Starmer's problem? He hasn't done the retail. He hasn't done the schmoozing. He hasn't told the Labour MPs, we love you, we need you, we want you to vote for our policies.
What is the Labour plan? What does Keir Starmer want to do in government? We're not entirely sure we know. The bigger question is, do those around him understand what the Prime Minister wants? Welcome to the News Agents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And by the time you're listening to us, you will probably know what the government's new welfare reform proposals look like and how much support it's going to get and how many people will be left in relative poverty against what the original proposals were. And Keir Starmer will be hoping that he has done enough to head off the most extraordinary rebellion 1 year into his term. But this whole episode has raised much bigger questions about who Keir Starmer is, what the people around him are like, whether he's delivering, whether they know or what they are trying to do in Downing Street.
Yeah, and I guess it's all coming to a head now with talk of a reset, with the people, maybe the personnel around Starmer about to shift. He's already lost one Chief of Staff, Sue Gray, last autumn. There are questions now swirling around Morgan McSweeney, who's generally credited with being a campaign genius, the man who got the Labour Party into power, but may not yet have found the right register with which to communicate with the MPs. And I think this is where we feel that the rubber is hitting the road now, because we've been hearing from people pretty close to Starmer, people who know the sort of the muscle memory of the Labour Party, of what a Prime Minister needs to do to reach out to the people who actually could hold his downfall, his government's downfall, in their hands. And some of it has been about the way, as you heard in that clip, they're feeling. You know, is there enough love going out to MPs? Are there thank you notes and texts? Is there a recognition of the important work that MPs are doing? And there are some, I think, who feel that the structure is very vertical at the moment. It is sort of Morgan McSweeney downwards. It isn't sort of reaching outwards. It isn't recognising the power that now many individual MPs hold. You know, they can do their own thing on social media. They can do their own thing as constituency MPs. They can make their own mark individually with their own voters without necessarily having to show loyalty to Keir Starmer. And if they think that he's not in the same place as their voters, as their constituents, then they won't align themselves with him.
Look, every Prime Minister tends to take a view that those people who sit on the back benches are there as lobby fodder. They are there to walk through the lobbies and take their marching orders, depending on the whips have told them how to vote. That's the perception that they've always had. But the way you handle those people differs. And what is striking is this top-down approach that you just talked about, Emily. Morgan McSweeney, right, you've got to be disciplined, you've got to do as you're told, you've got to vote according to how we tell you to vote, and if you don't, woe betide you. And these backbenchers have thought, you know what? Well, I don't care. It's very early in a parliament to have so many people willing to rebel and you get a taste for this thing. And I think it does represent a real challenge to Keir Starmer, because what if there are other important reforms, but maybe unpopular, that he wants to do in future? How on earth does he secure a majority? And they do seem to have been a little bit lax in not giving enough love to these people.
Yeah, and I guess, not to sort of oversimplify this, it's not just about love, it is about the reforms themselves. And if you understand what the policy is, if you've been brought along and supported and sort of talked through the policy itself, you are more likely to align yourself with it. And I think a lot of the messages coming out now from the MPs who don't see eye to eye with Starmer is that they feel it was always about cost cutting and not about the reform itself. And we've been hearing from people who've basically admitted to us that they don't really know what the Labour plan is. They don't really have a shape or a feel for what's in Starmer's mind. And one person I was speaking to said, look, they came into government as combatants. They were fighting first against Corbyn, against the old Labour left, then against the Conservatives in power. They understood their role as the outsider. They understood their role as the fighting machine. They got it. They got this huge landslide, but they didn't actually have the blueprint then for what that looked like. And I think now we're starting to feel that sort of fraying at the edges, aren't we? That you understand what they say they're going to do, but you don't really believe there is a narrative, a story or a shape to what is driving the Prime Minister in terms of getting policy through.
And that comes down to a sort of a lack of political feel of what you can do and what people will buy and what people will accept. And also, how do I sell it once I have done that? What's the communications message? What do I need to say to, the party members? What do I need to say to the unions? What do I need to say to the various stakeholders? And remember, this is a Labour Party that is made up of lots of people who've worked in the voluntary sector, who've worked for the sort of charities that are now objecting to many of the welfare reform measures. And I should just add that, although over the weekend Starmer has been trying to work on these revised proposals, Sadiq Khan has just come out, the Mayor of London, and said, not fit for purpose, this bill is still not right.
As has Andy Burnham.
So there is still strong headwinds.
Yeah, I remember having this conversation before Christmas, so after they'd been in power 6 months, with somebody who was pretty close to the team who said, I've never seen a Prime Minister with so little interest in the detail of policy. And I said, oh, which policy? And he said, all of it, and it is, in a way, it's a tribute to, a man who thinks he's got a great team around him that he can delegate. He can say, you're the Chancellor, you get on with that. You're the Deputy PM, you get on with that. But it comes back to this question of not really knowing what is in his head. And the person we're going to speak to now, I guess, is the closest thing you'd get to what we might call a Starmer whisperer. Somebody who not only has his ear, would probably call himself or be called a friend, but who has sort of been on this journey to power with Keir Starmer and was given a pretty extraordinary interview for The Observer last week in which Starmer admits, amongst other things, that he really never intended or meant to make that Island of Strangers speech. It kind of wasn't what he ever felt. And so we're going to talk to Tom Baldwin now about what he thinks the Prime Minister has got wrong and what he thinks the Prime Minister is actually trying to do.
And Tom, you have simultaneously been a Director of Communications for the Labour Party and for the leader of the Labour Party. You are also a journalist. You've also written a biography of Keir Starmer. I mean, it seems reading this interview, Tom, there was an awful lot that Keir Starmer wanted to get off his chest of things that he's done wrong.
Yeah, look, I mean, the origins of the interview were that I was doing another chapter for my biography, and I've done the first year in power, and that's coming out next month in paperback form, and very, very well priced. And I told them at the time that I'll turn this into an interview for Times, Observer, something like that, and they were happy enough about that. What was striking about the interview was he was very, very clear that he wanted to correct the record about the Islands of Stranger speech. I mean, I double-checked with him and he said, sure you want to say it? Yes, I want that to be clear.
And the Island of Strangers speech is the speech he made on immigration about what had happened to Britain and how we were an island of strangers, and there were the echoes of Enoch Powell.
Yeah, and he thinks it does echo Enoch Powell, and he says he would never have done that if he had known it echoed Enoch Powell. He doesn't blame his speechwriters, and there's big mitigating circumstances in that his house had been firebombed the previous night and he'd been up all night, so he hadn't read it through properly. I mean, I've heard people saying it's extraordinary that the Prime Minister admits he doesn't read his speeches properly. You know, on that occasion he hadn't, and he admits a mistake. I think it's actually quite refreshing when politicians admit mistakes. I mean, the comments under the Observer piece are quite interesting, that you usually go to them with some trepidation. And so many people saying how good it is, how strong it is to see someone admitting mistakes.
Can I just follow up on that? Because he admits mistakes, but he says, well, the speechwriter didn't know. And there is also a bit of throwing under the bus of some of the special advisors around him, whilst at the same time simultaneously saying, I take full responsibility.
Well, he takes full responsibility for appointing the team around him as well. I do think there has been occasions over the last year where people have tried to push him into being someone I don't think he is. So the Keir Starmer we see on the foreign stage is this grown-up, stolid figure who understands how complicated the world is, understands you don't go into a meeting with NATO or the White House with a big new idea and here's my vision. It's really hard to get any progress. And I think people respect that Keir Starmer. And I think the one we've seen on the domestic stage, I think it's been moving around. I think, some days he's an insurgent disruptor. Some days he's insulting the civil service for sitting in a tepid bath of managed decline or the flabby state or attacking environmentalists. And I don't think that's what his politics are. And so I think what this interview was him saying very clearly, I think the most significant line in that interview was, we need to take on reform. It needs to be a fight for the heart and soul of this nation, and we do so as a progressive party. Yes, Labour must beat reform as a progressive Labour Party. Now, that is a choice.
Tom, can we just go back a second? We introduced you at the beginning. We didn't say that you're actually a friend of Starmer's. You would call yourself a friend of Starmer's.
Yeah, I'm a journalist, I'm a writer, I'm on good terms with him. I mean, he's got very, very old friends. And I always feel awkward sort of claiming to be a friend, but I like him and I trust him, yeah.
So when he calls you in, does he say, we need to do that interview now? Do you give him copy approval of what you wrote?
No. I mean,
Did he sign off what you wrote?
I've double-checked some things with him when I want to be clear about what he wants to say. So I did double-check the quotes he gave about Island as a Stranger because I knew it would be controversial. I knew that there would be perhaps people around him be unhappy about it.
I mean,
and I really wanted to double check this.
It is really significant that one of the most controversial speeches that he's made in office in this first year is something that he's now told you he never intended to say. I mean, that's an extraordinary place to be.
It is, and I've explained some of the mitigating circumstances about it. It's not like he never reads what the speeches he makes. I think he actually spends quite a lot of time going through them usually. But I think it's quite interesting that people thought it was the sort of thing he might have
That's
said.
my point. So I guess the question it raises is, are the people around him getting him wrong? Are they misinterpreting what he is really like? Or do they just actually not know what he really believes in or thinks? Because you've just laid out the way he wants to target reform voters is with progressive Labour policies. At the same time, I'm reading elsewhere, he wants to try and find a way of sort of bringing back people who might be authoritarian leaning. That sounds to me very different directions, which seems to go to the heart of the Starmer issue, which is we don't actually know the project, we don't know the plan, and it sounds like those around him don't know the man.
So that's a multi-layered question. I'm going to give you a multi-layered answer if you don't mind. So I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to say we want to fight reform as a progressive Labour Party. Indeed, in my interview, he makes it very clear he doesn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. He does think the Labour Party became too distant from the working classes on issues like immigration. So, you can have a bit of both, and you can have a message for the whole country rather than just one section of voters. I think he's very aware that Labour have been losing far more voters to progressive parties, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, than they have to reform. And I think he's very aware that there's a lazy media narrative which interprets everything Labour does as through the prism of reform, surge and upholds and so on. And so rather than trying to beat reform by being a bit like them, I think he does want to make clear that there's a different Labour case. And Labour's position on immigration, I think, 85% of it I'm quite happy with, and it's very much Labour rather than anything to do with reform. And,
so give us an example, because, we were talking earlier about this idea that when they came into office, they could have just done something very demonstrable and very direct straight away. For example, said, we're going to introduce ID cards. You will soon know exactly who's arriving on these shores, whether they have ID cards, who's illegal, who isn't. It would have sent out a very clear signal and a change of direction, and been quite controversial, but said this is our plan. We get illegal immigration and we're going to tackle it head on. We're all in this place where we're sort of talking in very abstract terms about what is a progressive policy, what is a reform policy. Give me a sense of what that means.
So I think when they came in, they made a number of mistakes, one of which was to embark on this quite extraordinary internal briefing against each other, which I think I said last time I was on the newsagents, elevated office politics above real politics. I think it sent a message to voters that they're more interested in themselves than the people, and I think that was awful. I still think it was really weird. I don't think we've actually...
The getting rid of Sue Gray.
No, just about it's continued some of this briefing. I think Keir is now beginning to crack down on it, and that's part of reasserting himself on Downing Street. But I mean, look, I've been an advisor. I know it's difficult. I don't want to sort of get into a sort of thing of slagging off advisors. I think there is something about Keir himself which is hard to grasp, and I've struggled with this as his biographer, in that he doesn't like to put all of himself out there. He does have really strong values and emotions, and through his life he's buttoned them up. When he was growing up at home, his dad was a difficult man. His mum was very disabled. His brother had learning difficulties. There were 4 dogs. There were 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. There's no room there for him to learn to emote. And I think his life has been about controlling his emotions and not letting people see it. Now, this is a problem if you're a political advisor. You're trying to work out who this guy is you're working for and what's his big thing. And we also have a culture in politics and the media now of we need a new big idea, we need drama, we need the Tom McTague interview with Keir Starmer was fascinating. And he kept saying to Keir, don't you agree this is the 1979 moment where we have to bring it all down? And Keir goes, no, I don't. I think I saw him again 3 weeks later. Are you sure it's not a big bring it all down moment? Yes, I'm sure, because that's the problem.
But what he's expressing is that people around him, including, I guess, journalists, not that we matter, don't know what he wants.
Well, I think the answer is actually to listen to what he says and listen to and see what he does, in that there's lots of small things and lots of things you can do. There isn't necessarily a big idea. I think the problem of our politics at the moment is we've had too many big, ideas. We've had Brexit, we've had austerity, we've had some mad populist stuff, and it's not helping. So what you see on the international stage is someone who is trying to work out a better way of doing things to get to a better place. And it's complicated. Why can't we make a brand out of that?
OK, so let's just take the problems that he's had over welfare reform. If the counterfactual is that had he had more time to focus on it, he would have headed off the crisis earlier. Well, one, he should have been. And surely a Prime Minister is able to do more than one thing at once. And secondly, you have a Chief of Staff who is there to know the absolute innermost thinking. I was speaking to someone who knows this Downing Street operation very well, and he said you've got a whole bunch of people working in there who are high on arrogance and low on knowledge. They don't know what Keir Starmer wants. Now, isn't that a failing of Keir Starmer? And you can, Tom, you and I have been around a long time. You knew the Blair operation. You'd have gone in and seen Blair. And, the policy people, the Miliband's, the Peter Hymans would have known what to do. Alistair would have been pumping out the press message. Angie Hunter would have been writing a thank you note to the MP who'd just come in to see him. All of that would have happened. And you may not have headed off every rebellion under the sun, but you would have sure as hell made it much more difficult for these people to rebel. Keir Starmer hasn't done the retail.
Well, in Tony's first year in Downing Street, he did have a rebellion of about 150 MPs on welfare, and we forget that sometimes. But you're right. I think that what there was clarity about who the Prime Minister was, and everyone was working to that goal. And I think sometimes in the absence of Keir being clear about himself or asserting himself over Downing Street, you've had other narratives growing up, sometimes multiple ones. And that's confusing for the people who work for him, it's confusing for the biographers of this world. And so I think what you're seeing is Keir beginning to understand the four most important words in Whitehall are the Prime Minister wants. You know, when people start briefing against Bridget Phillips or Ed Miliband, he phones them up and says, this is untrue. And he asks people, I don't want to see this again. And I think it is dying down, that briefing now. Having characterised this government for a year, I think everything he's done since Runcorn, with the exception of the immigration speech, that's why he wanted to correct the record on it so much, with the exception of the immigration speech, has been leaning into this position of we take reform on as a progressive Labour Party. So that's why the immigration speech stood out like a sore thumb in that context. And then on the welfare changes, I think how do we get into this problem is because I think there was a laziness about how they briefed it. You know, I don't question their motives. Don't think they were trying to do some sort of anti-welfare benefit cheat stuff, but they allowed a big round figure of £5 billion, which looks like a cut to me rather than a reform. They allowed, I think, tropes, which we're very familiar with, of the deserving and the undeserving poor to percolate into some of their language. And that's why you get a mess.
I hear all of that. But what happened with the welfare reform is that other people, we'd been saying it on this podcast for weeks, my God, there's a growing rebellion, there is really unease. And after you'd done the U-turn on winter fuel payments, you thought this is going to be the next thing. It seemed to be the only person who hadn't seen it coming was Keir Starmer.
Well, I think there's some people in his office who hadn't seen it coming as well. I mean, you know, I've heard anecdotes about people saying it wasn't going to be much of a problem. We've only got 90 rebels, and some of them pointed out, well, 90 rebels means we lose the vote.
So finish your sentence then. Keir Starmer wants what? I mean, what does he want? If he doesn't want the Island of Strangers speech to be the thing that remains, what does he want? What is the progressive policy then on immigration?
So he wants to get things done. Now, on immigration, that means training more British workers. That means limiting visas for some migrants. I mean, personally, I've got some problems with some of the student stuff and some of the care worker stuff. It does mean recognising that, you know, quadrupling the number of immigrants coming into this country as we did after Brexit probably wasn't what people voted for in Brexit. And I think that's fine. But there isn't necessarily what frustrates me with speeches like that is you've got quite a nuanced, complicated set of proposals. And there's people who think, we need to have a row about it, or we need to have some ringing phrase which everyone will capture and go, that's what it's about. Politics is complicated. Good government is necessarily complicated.
It's not the ringing phrase, Tom. You need a plan. And you still haven't told me.
I
You've said
think
you
there is
know
a
a
plan.
lot of times. I still wouldn't know what the Keir Starmer plan was. If he thinks that immigration's too high, if he still wants to have students with visas, what is that plan then?
Well, it's a multi-layered set of policies designed to reduce the number of immigrants coming into this country, ensure we still get high-skilled immigrants coming into this country, ensure we train more British workers. I think that's a plan there. It's not very exciting for journalists to cover or for people to write speeches about. And that's the problem, that we're addicted to this drama and hyperbole and big ideas, when in fact good politics could actually be about, you know, really boring things like how do you get the small number of small boats down? Keir Starmer said this once. It's really boring. It's about processing a number of claims faster.
So on welfare,
it's not about having the Navy in the Channel.
You said they got the branding wrong or the comms wrong on welfare. Do you genuinely think that the welfare policy was a good one, that they just missold?
No, I think it is a policy that needed to be improved, and that what they've done is improve it, and it's almost politics working as it should. Now, again, in Westminster...
You don't really think it's improved now when you've got anyone who may find themselves disabled the day after the bill comes through on a completely different set of payouts to people who are already receiving disability payment?
I think there's a history of introducing reforms which don't affect current recipients, so whether that's student loans and student fees or whatever. So I mean,
you can decide if you want to be a student. You can decide if you want to have more than 2 children. You can decide if you smoke. You cannot decide if you're going to end up disabled. Look, none of us can.
I'm not here to defend every dot and comma of a government welfare reform. What I am, I think, here to talk about is a style of politics which doesn't pretend that you get everything right the first time, that is ready to incrementally improve things, and if you make mistakes, take a step to the side or take a step backwards and then a step forward. That is the Keir Starmer I know. And the idea that he comes in, on July the 5th last year and says, I know the answer to everything. I've got one big idea and I will never apologise for anything because I'm never going to get anything wrong. I think that's hokum.
Do you think that he can create a narrative? If you're saying, okay, I'm Keir Starmer and what I am is dull incrementalism, slow, boring steps that might methodically make things a bit better, which is what you're arguing is what he is about. Can you sell that? Can you sell that to the British people? Doesn't he need to be able to sell something a bit more than that? Because that doesn't seem to get people very excited and is not going to do much to dent the surging popularity of reform.
Well, okay, I don't think I advocated him saying, I stand for dull incrementalism, so that's not a slogan that
Yeah,
even
I know.
would.
Okay,
that's not even one of my slogans.
That's not an unfair.
You wouldn't get it on the lectern, to be fair, would you?
Dull incrementalism.
Yeah.
I mean, these 3 words as well.
New Labour, dull incrementalism. There we are.
Look, I think at his best, he actually represents the British people, the vast majority of British people. As he says, they're tolerant, decent people. They're not screaming, you're a pedophile, raper, genocide enabler before they've had their cornflakes at each other. They are complicated people. They have loose ends. They don't always agree about everything. They don't have absolute. They don't sit there and say, "I've got my own solution for the economy or for growth." They know it's difficult, but there's a huge well of decency. That's what he thinks. So when people keep saying to him, "Britain's broken and we need to start again," he says, "No, it isn't." He, in his mind's eye, identifies with the British people, with all their lumps and folds and different contours. And I think at his best, he is a Prime Minister who can fit into the contours of the British people. Like common law, he's a lawyer. And, it's got loose ends. It takes a few judgments before you begin to get a jurisprudence and a sense of where it's going. And it's not going in straight lines like Roman law and Napoleonic codes. It's very English. And at his best, he can be that. What doesn't work is when he pretends to be someone else.
So has he got the right people around him?
I think he's got brilliant people around him. I think it's very important that he.
You said they got it wrong over welfare.
I think they're lazy about that, and I think I've spoken to them, and they take it on the chin. They accept that there were mistakes made in the way they presented welfare. They're learning too. It's really important that people learn when they do their jobs. You could do better and worse podcasts, but when you do a bad one, you don't say, that was brilliant, I'm going to do exactly the same next week. You're going to do a better one next week because you learn from your mistakes.
I always say I'm brilliant.
Well, that's probably why, Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart keep beating you in the ratings.
Oh, don't go there. But do you think that Starmer feels confident about how he needs to change this around?
I think there isn't a single thing. And it's a series of small things and many things. That is him. It's not like, right, I know what I got wrong, I've got to do this. It's much more, can we do that bit better? Right, okay, there's a better way of doing it. Can we do that bit better? And slowly, but surely, you get to a better place. That is actually how the real world works. That's how any business or organisation improves. It's not kind of, we're going to reinvent the wheel. And I think the problem with politics, particularly in a country like this, as constrained as we are by the economy and international factors and all kinds of other problems, to come in and say we've got a big idea is going to be terrible for cynicism about politics, because it won't work. What will work is to show that slowly but surely you can make things better, and we're going to treat people as grown-ups because we've got a grown-up Prime Minister. That, for me, is our best chance for a better politics in this country.
So if your analysis, Tom, as in your piece, is that he has now got to redirect, because, there is going to be some sort of reset, we can all assume, after this. You don't come away from saying, I massively regretted the language I used on a speech on immigration without presumably resetting what you do next. Does this mean he is now going to be thinking much more about a kind of progressive Labour left messaging? Is he talking to Lib Dem voters? Is he talking to Green voters?
Look, I think Keir Starmer won't want to lose votes to any political party or to non-voters either. But the truth is, if you look at any opinion poll, dig into the detail, Labour are losing 3 times as many votes to Liberal Democrats and the Greens than they are to Reform. There's a media narrative which says, Reform are up 10 points, Labour are down 10 points, there must be a direct transfer. It's a much, much more complicated churn. So I think you need to develop a message which actually speaks to the whole country and speaks to what Keir Starmer says, which is if there's going to be a battle for the heart and soul of this country against a populist right-wing party like Reform, then let's be Labour, a progressive party, and let's win that battle for progressive politics.
And are you sure that's not your message? I mean, you were.
Well, those were
Ed
his
Miliband's
words.
side.
Those were his words. Now, look, there's always a danger, because Keir's a complicated person, of people projecting themselves onto him, whether that's people who work for him in Downing Street, or whether that's people who write books about him, or whether people who do podcasts about him. That's certainly true. I think that what Keir is actually trying to say is he wants to stand for that decent, tolerant majority in this country who aren't, part of this horrible polarised politics. In a crowded square, the people's with the loudest voice are the ones that get heard, but they're not necessarily most people.
So let me ask you something then, because he was very, very straight talking at the beginning of the year, defending Jess Phillips, slamming down Elon Musk on this whole question of whether the country needed another inquiry into grooming gangs. And his point at that time was, actually, we know what's going wrong. We know what's gone wrong. We have to help the victims at the centre of this, not pander to, what zillionaires in the US are telling us to do. But he reversed his decision on that.
Well, what he did is he appointed Louise Casey to review it, right? So, are there problems? Okay. And then she came up with the idea of not actually having another full national inquiry, because we've actually had lots of national inquiries, but having a sort of a coordinating body for these local bodies. Now, you can call that a massive U-turn, or you can call that someone who takes evidence to look at the facts, and then you follow the facts. I think that's good government again.
Tom, just on that, Guido Fawkes reporting today that Louise Casey is now advising the Prime Minister on communication policy, how to get things out there.
Well, Louise Casey's very good at getting things out there, isn't she? So, great. But I mean, I wouldn't believe anything. I would have to get a double source. I wouldn't just go on Guido Fawkes.
And we're all kind of getting aware, whether it's kind of socially or on social media, the sort of declinist Britain narrative, oh, I got on a train and it was awful and I nearly got mugged. Oh, I got on a tube and people looked at me as if they wanted to take my phone. Again, does Keir Starmer then respond to that by saying, oh, for fuck's sake, grow up? Or does he say, I hear you and that's a real worry?
Look, this country has got huge deep-seated problems. Is it fundamentally broken? No. Are there great people in it? The people, as he talks about, who came out after the riots in Southport, cleared up. The people who checked on their neighbours during the pandemic. That's the Britain he wants. And I remember seeing him in some round table in Grimsby once. And there's a woman there who's saying, I don't really get all this politics. I don't get the difference between you and Rishi Sunak. It's all so boring. And any other politician I know would have gone, I'll tell you the difference. And he came alive. He said, I know just what you mean. And most normal people don't spend all their time worrying whether you're Tory, Labour, Liberal Democrat, Reform, whatever. They just want their families to do better, their community to do better, and their country to do better. And so do I. And I'll work with anyone who wants to say, now, if you can bottle that, that is effective politics.
Just a final thought. 1 year in, is the die cast now on the Starmer premiership? Because, this interview feels like 1 year in, this is all the things that have gone wrong. Your interview with him.
Look, I think they've done quite a lot of good stuff as well. And I think we're spending all our time talking about the bad stuff, and I think that some of the long-term stuff they've done is actually really necessary and really impressive. Look, politics is febrile. The electorate is volatile, and the media wants to jump on everything and say we've now worked out exactly what's happening. I think that's a foolish course for anybody to go down. The truth is that this government does feel a bit older than it should after 1 year. It is more battered and bruised than it should be with a big majority after 1 year. It has had terrible inheritance and bad luck, and it's made lots of mistakes. But Keir Starmer, I think, is someone who's capable of learning. I think if you looked at him 1 year into his leadership of the Labour Party, you might have thought he was finished too. And I remember him once saying to me, I don't really mind when people write me off and so I'll be gone in a year or two, because it just means they're making the mistakes they've made about me in the past, which is to underestimate him. And if you look at the history of his own predecessor as Labour Party, he's no longer a member of the Labour Party, 3 Conservative Prime Ministers, countless other opponents, I think they all made the mistake of underestimating him, and I wouldn't do it again.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. In a moment, we'll be talking Glastonbury. What is the wrong side of the line, and did it get crossed at the weekend?
Well, in the last hour or so, the BBC has admitted it should have pulled the live stream of Bob Vylan's Glastonbury performance over the weekend because it contained utterly unacceptable and anti-Semitic sentiments. And if you're coming to Bob Vylan for the first time, then you are probably joining about 98% of the population who has been learning about this punk duo that played Glastonbury. Everyone's eyes, I think, were on the Belfast group Kneecap, already condemned by the Prime Minister Keir Starmer for some of their lyrics and performances at concerts. And it was the turn of a very little known sort of alternative band, right, who in the end stole the headlines from this whole weekend. You know, despite every other act, they were the ones that stole the headlines because they played chants which included threats to Israel's defence force, the army, IDF, and we're going to play you some here in case you missed it.
Free, free! Free, free! Free, free! Alright, but have you heard this one though? Death, death to the IDF! Death, death to the IDF! Death, death to the IDF! Death, death to the IDF!
Death, death to the IDF. And in other words, kill Jewish soldiers. It's calling for the murder of Jews who are serving in the armed forces as part of the Israeli Defence Force. And it has been roundly condemned by just about everybody, the BBC, the organisers of Glastonbury. But it's not just the condemnation, it's also kind of stoked a culture war where, as you say, Emily, a little known band that I had never heard of before
And
Glastonbury.
of you, to be fair, if you haven't heard of it,
So,
Jesus, they are nowhere.
Has anyone got their finger on the pulse of popular culture like me? And they're suddenly, of course, celeb, and they're getting attention that they could have only ever dreamed of as a result of some of the attacks coming their way. It was gratuitous. It was offensive. Of course, the plug should have been pulled earlier. Although I do have a certain sympathy that, I can imagine that the producers of this are so busy wondering, OK, camera 3 to camera 2, can we get a tight cutaway of the audience, please? That is what you are hearing as a presenter in your ear, of the directions being given to the director, that no one's actually bloody listening to a word they're saying. I mean, the fact that it took them 5 hours to take it off of iPlayer, huge mistake. But it going out live at the time, I suspect that the people were concentrating on so many other things that nobody had noticed, but they bloody well should have done.
And I guess on the one hand, everyone is responding to their natural base here. The idea that the Tories wouldn't have a lot of time for the BBC and Glastonbury is not, breaking news to us. And I guess Keir Starmer is the one who feels that he's always had to tread this very careful line on the whole question of Gaza and Israel, and he's been adamant that whatever you feel politically about the situation, it shouldn't come down to anti-Semitism, at home. And to have hundreds, maybe even thousands of people chanting that alongside the members of the band is clearly a pretty unedifying spectacle. But I guess the question you think it raises is about whether the BBC even plays Glastonbury.
So, it is not the first time that rock musicians have decided that the best way to get attention is to do something outrageous. I mean, the moral panic that was caused by Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and
Sex
on
Pistols.
and on. The Sex Pistols going on
Frankie.
Thames Television. It goes on and on. Frankie Goes to Hollywood. The list kind of goes on and on. This did cross a horrible line. I mean, imagine being a young Jewish attendee of Glastonbury, of whom I know some, and hearing people calling for the death of Jews. It's not going to make you feel great. And particularly after October the 7th, when it was at a music festival that hundreds were killed, raped, murdered by Hamas. So, unpleasant is in the extreme. But is it a thing for the BBC to be giving you wall-to-wall coverage all weekend of a music festival to the exclusion of a lot of other things in the schedule, Why does the BBC need to do Glastonbury?
The BBC is the broadcaster of public service. So it shows Wimbledon, you don't have a problem with that. It shows World Cups, we don't have a problem with that. It shows royal weddings, we don't have a problem with that. This is, an internationally recognised festival that thousands of people would love to enjoy, but either can't get there, maybe they can't afford to, or they can't get there, or whatever, and they'd love to be sitting at home. You had Pulp on Saturday night, you had Rod Stewart yesterday, you had a whole stream of people who are probably thinking, don't ruin it for everyone else who's actually had an amazing weekend. Don't just talk about, these idiots. Don't just talk about the chants. Don't just talk about the one thing that went wrong when it was a whole weekend of really good feeling.
So is it fair to say, though, that the problem with Glastonbury is that it, you go back to Jeremy Corbyn kind of being venerated as this hero figure and everyone chanting, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," that it's kind of perceived as this sort of rather left-wing festival. There you've got the BBC as impartial, having to show impartiality, and it's bloody difficult. They didn't carry kneecap live because they knew that was going to be offensive. They've instead been undone by these other Herberts who kind of were shouting kind of death to the IDF. That maybe this is just not the place that the BBC needs to be giving wall-to-wall coverage, which actually leads to many more problems.
Unlike, the proms, which, we could have the debate about the land of hope and glory every single year, and there'll be lots of people saying, I didn't need to hear the proms every night in August, every night of the summer.
But the BBC was putting Glastonbury on for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours across every kind of channel, it felt like. And it was, to the exclusion of a lot of other things. Look, I think that it seemed to what happened was I think I'm right in saying it with Glastonbury was that YouTube wanted to screen Glastonbury. The BBC paid a huge sum of money, how much we do not know, to maintain kind of exclusivity over showing Glastonbury. And, the BBC has now got itself into a right old mess over this. And I bet you can imagine what it's like at New Broadcasting House today as they're trying to figure out, oh, God, does someone have to carry the can for this? What are we going to do? We've got the government on our back. We've got everybody on our back. Even Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, is on their back about it all.
The BBC now feels under the cosh from people who found this deeply offensive. Does it affect what happens in its coverage on the other side? Because this was also the weekend in which the Doctors of Gaza documentary, which the BBC delayed showing, has now been picked up by Channel 4. And there are many people in the BBC who work in the BBC who feel that actually they have not really represented the people of Gaza, not really represented the suffering that's been going on well enough. And I guess the trouble with this whole slightly confected, slightly ridiculous Glastonbury row is that it probably will have an impact now on the kind of coverage that the BBC feels able to do on really serious issues, which is actually what's going on in Gaza right now.
Sure. I mean, look, the raw nerve ends are felt on both sides, aren't they? That if you are, from a pro-Palestinian, sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, you believe that the BBC has been grotesquely kind of sugarcoating what has been happening in Gaza and not painting a real picture of it. And if you are Jewish or Israeli, you feel that the BBC has not been giving, the Jews a fair rap. And look at that. They've broadcast on their television screen someone shouting death to the IDF and calling for the murder of thousands of Israelis. I think that, there is a no-win situation there that both sides feel that it's been kind of appallingly treated. And I think the emotions are raw on both sides.
We'll be back with some tennis news next.
You can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious. That ball was on the line.
John McEnroe, the most famous moment in Wimbledon. But those sort of moments are to be no more. But the question is it a threat to our British identity, the fact that Wimbledon has started, shock horror, without line judges?
Yes, Richard Tice tweeted first thing this morning, we want our country back. We want Wimbledon line judges back. Enough is enough. And you can feel a bit of Niemoller coming on there, can't you? First they came for the line judges, but I did not speak out because I was not a line judge. And then they came for the umpires and I did not speak out because I was not an umpire.
I know. It's just extraordinary. I love that, we must get our country back. And you think, what's the latest cause of which we must get our country back? And it seems to be Wimbledon and line judges. Leave to one side the fact that all sorts of other tennis tournaments haven't had line judges for years. There is the technology in place not to need line judges. And one, they wear silly costumes that are made by Ralph Lauren. Two, they get things wrong. And three, the only amusing moments is when a 140-mile serve gets them in the goolies and they fold over and go, ooh, like that. And then there's a kind of nervous titters in the audience.
The point is, I mean, you're a tennis fan, so
Yeah.
you can actually say with some credibility that you will not miss the line judges because you want accurate tennis. I have to say, as somebody who sort of snoozes on the sofa to tennis, I love those little shouts and I love the little, kind of bits in the out and all that. That's the only bit of tennis I hear. But I do think that Tice has been weirdly smart on this because I don't know if you saw the front page of the Times today, the top banner headline was about AI taking graduates' jobs. And I just think it is not far to weave through what he's saying about line judges to what he's saying about AI. We had Yuval Noah Harari on the show talking about, the new wave of immigrant being AI. And somehow he has connected that. And I think it will resonate with people that whether or not you care about Wimbledon or you care about the out or you care about the technological sort of perfection of what's coming next, you hear something that sounds like a bit of a threat. They're out of a job. Who's going to be next? What's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to my kids' jobs? And it's sort of starting a drumbeat, which I think will actually be quite effective, which is the Britain we know, the Wimbledon we know, the institutions we know are disappearing and they're coming for you next. You're not giving Richard Tice just a bit too much intellectual credit here, are you? I mean, I think that I don't think personally that anyone who attends a Wimbledon match who is there for the tennis will miss the line judges. But I do think they are extraordinarily smart, actually. And you were talking about retail politics before. This is retail politics in the extreme. Is just finding that little tiny wedge that makes people go, oh, God, they've gone. What happens now? Well, I mean, maybe you're right. I just read that Tice tweet and thought, silly. I thought it was just, oh, come on. Britain is not being defined and it's something that's happening around the world. And, anyone who watches tennis knows that line judges are going and that... And you wish they were, the same in football, right? Yeah, exactly. I just want VAR to be better, frankly. I'd happily, if we didn't have linesmen and women, but we were getting all the calls right and there wasn't a bloody matches being stopped for 4 minutes over a VAR check, happy days. On that bombshell, we will be back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye. See you then. Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.